Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Bass Stravaganza. This isn't really going to be an episode, just an extended rant, so I don't recommend that people should watch it. It's too boring. It's intended as a kind of manifesto because it marks a shift in the direction, like when you're tacking into the wind in a sailboat. If you're one of the millions of people who watch every episode of the Bass Stravaganza, you'll remember that it started out as a tribute to the exceptional smallmouth bass fishery here on Van Isle. And my semi-fictional hero Humpty would go out bass fishing at local lakes and jabber about how it was one of the last good, stable, wild recreational fisheries here on Van Isle. And it was set against the utter devastation of the wild salmon and trout and steelhead fisheries here that earned Van Isle the dubious reputation of being the world's modern-day leader in wild salmonid extinction. And when he was out for bass, Humpty didn't just tell you what lake he was fishing on. He'd say, I'm fishing underneath the great smallmouth wall of death at Quesnel Lake, or I'm fishing at Crag and Tail Reef on Shawnigan Lake. And the plan was that he would occasionally sneak off to some undisclosed location and catch and release a few of our increasingly rare native wild trout or cohos or steelhead, and then get back to bass fishing. So the intent was to serve as a tribute to the bass fishery, which had been world class for over a century, and as a memorial or epitaph to the historic wild salmon and steelhead fisheries and trout fisheries that were driving to extinction here on Van Isle. So I started filming and publishing these Bass Stravaganza episodes under that plan, but the whole concept was rendered obsolete a few years ago when the province reclassified smallmouth bass from recreational game fish to invasive species and changed a century of policy from one that required catch and release of the big spawning bass in spring to regs that encourage anglers to slaughter all the bass they can catch. So obviously that blows a big hole in this video series. Humpty doesn't go bass fishing anymore. And moreover, it means that the only remaining fishing part of this show would be publicizing fisheries that are going extinct fast. My original intent was to provide some documentary evidence that there still were a few trophy wild salmonids on Van Isle and that it was worth the effort to save them from extinction. I was never trying to promote these places as popular fisheries, and I was always uncomfortable in the role of publishing that wild salmonid video. That's why I'd refer to those locations as nameless lakes on YouTube, N1 Lake, N2 Lake, N3 Lake, etc. I'm not comfortable publishing a video series across the internet that becomes a record of Humpty being the last guy to catch the last Chinook in this river, or the last sockeye out of this lake, or the last steelhead on Van Isle. So there's a real simple way to solve that problem. Don't do it. So I rarely go fishing at all anymore, and if I do, I probably don't bring a camera along. And if I happen to hook into a beauty wild fish, I'm probably not going to publish that video onto YouTube. So basically that means Humpty has gone into retirement. And that must come as a shock to, all the thousands of guys out there that get up first thing every morning and tune into their computers to see if there's a new episode of the Bass Stravaganza. So, times are tough and you have to be strong. But of course, the biggest tragedy is for the ladies. As everyone knows who's been in the position of being a internet... Oh, here comes a plane overhead. I'm near Nanaimo Airport. I better shut up for a minute. Nice to see a few planes flying again after COVID. So, does any of us know, you guys out there who've been in the position of being like international internet bass fishing superheroes? There's nothing that turns women on more than a guy that catches great big bass. And if you're in the position of being a guy that catches bass on topwater hits on homemade lures, it basically just the most beautiful young women in the world basically just throw themselves at your feet. It's shameless, really. And now that we have this plague going around, we're not supposed to travel. And I'd never thought about it that much before, but I might be the only Canadian bass fishing superhero west of Calgary, west of Winnipeg, for all I know. So every beautiful young woman in this whole western half of this great country is, oh no, Humpty's not going bass fishing. What are we going to do? He was our hero. So all I can say is hang in there, hang tough. We're going to beat this COVID thing together, and someday you'll be able to hop on a plane just like that one that flew overhead, and you'll be able to fly back to Ontario, and maybe you can hang out with Gordon Italo, or maybe you could go party with Bob Izumi. I think Bob Izumi's married. I don't know what his wife would have. She might get in on it. She might want to hop in with you. I don't know. Anyway, it's been fun. It's been a good ride, but ladies, Humpty is officially off the table as an internet bass fishing superstar. You know, it gets to be a problem after a while. You think nobody's watching. I think nobody ever looks at my videos, but they're out there on the worldwide interweb. Anybody could tune into it. And last time I published a bass fishing episode, it was a long time ago. I'd go out a couple mornings later, my driveway, to walk across and go water my garden, and there's 3 or 4 smoking hot babes standing out there. Excuse my sexist language, but they're absolutely stacked with the short shorts and the halter tops, and I'm like, who are you? What are you doing here? And the blonde says, oh, Humpty, we saw you catch that big bass on the internet, and we had to come out here and meet you and hang out with you. And then the redhead says, oh, Humpty, we'll pull weeds out of your garden if just tell us that story again about how you carved your own homemade lure and threw it out by that sunken log, and that big bass came up and grabbed it. So it was getting out of hand, and it'll be a relief to me to see Humpty heading off into the sunset. But before I continue, I'm going to contradict myself right away. I did sneak out once this year just to perform my annual steelhead ceremony. My dad's side of the family are Bespoleks from České Budějovice, where they invented the real Budweiser, and my mom's side of the family are Novies from Pilsen, where they invented Pilsner. So for the past few years, I've been celebrating each new fishing season with a toast. And the first time, I was holding on to a nice wild steelhead in one hand with a bottle of Czech Bar in the other. And the next year, I made the same toast with a bottle of Urquell. And last year, I switched back to Czech Bar. So this was supposed to be another Urquell year, but I spaced out, and I brought along a bottle of Czech Bar by mistake. And, you know, this is reality TV, so there's no way to go back and change it. There we go. So my apologies to all the good people of Pilsen. They're good people. No insult was intended. And my favorite rock. My apologies to the folks that make Urquell. It's a darn good beer, too. Let's have a toast to Czech Bar beer and wild steelhead. And also my apologies to all the Novies everywhere. They're good people. I don't want to start a clan war between the Novies and the Bespoleks. Caught on my dad's homemade spinner. 1950s. Let's see what we got here now. Mosquitoes. Oh, it's a nice one, about 5, 6. Not a big one. 7, 8, 9. That's a nice fish. Well, let us have a toast, good people, to Czechvar and Wild Steelhead 2021. Tastes so good. The buck. Long and lean. Okay, come on. That's the way we do it at Fabulous N2 Lake. That single barbless comes right out. Spawned out male. Another season of wild steelhead and Czechvar beer. Welcome to the Bass Stravaganza. So that's also a fine wild fish, and that's enough steelhead fishing for this year. I'd pop it open and have a toast, but it's first thing in the morning and I got to drive back, so save this for another day. But it's not the end of the Bass Stravaganza, not by a long shot. During the past 5 or 6 years that I've been teaching myself how to run a GoPro and do basic video editing, I also shot a huge amount of raw fishing video that I have archived and stored on remote hard drives. So there'll be many more episodes to come of your hero Humpty out tormenting the wily bass. It's just that the video will be from the past, and instead of being a tribute to a world-class sustainable wild fishery as it was intended, this Bass Stravaganza becomes by default a memorial and an epitaph to yet another Van Isle wild fishery fast fading into memory. That's why I want to post this boring episode. Stay on my today. You can see we're getting that COVID on the run. When I filmed the last time here, there was, you go here all day long and not hardly see a plane. We're outside Nanaimo Airport. Anyway, that's why I want to post this boring episode, just to explain what's going on here. I wasn't paying attention when they changed the regs, so it looks stupid now to hear Humpty chatting about this wonderful, sustainable wild fishery when it was already a thing of the past. And before going on, I want to briefly discuss some of the implications of this recent change in policy. Smallmouth bass were brought here to Vancouver Island in 1902 at great expense by the Federal Dominion of Fisheries, by the federal government. They were planted in a handful of lakes for the purpose of establishing a quality recreational fishery in a few urban, suburban lakes. And they performed that role well for over a century. I'm totally in favor of retaining world-class trophy recreational fishery in these original smallmouth bass lakes. And I'm also in favor of killing off every single bass here on Van Isle. But I'm very opposed to the policy that's going down now, and I want to discuss that in the remainder of this boring episode. In my opinion, smallmouth bass either have to be managed as a valuable recreational game fish or as a dangerous invasive species. They cannot be managed as both. I fished for bass in more different watersheds than anyone else I know, from famous trophy rivers to lakes swarming with zillions of runted bass, from California to Van Isle to Quebec to Florida. The one unique aspect of the historic Van Isle smallmouth fishery here, compared to all the others I ever saw, was the average size of the fish. Hardly anyone ever fished for bass here, except me and a few other people, and we mostly let them go after we caught them. The result was a population, a trophic structure you might call it if you had a PhD, dominated by a small group of big old bass. Unfortunately, in my opinion, when the feds imported the original smallmouth bass broodstock from Lake Ontario, they also imported pumpkin seed sunfish along with the bass. And these sunfish now swarm in most of the bass lakes here. For over a century, some bass got big and fat, and they ate enormous amounts of sunfish. In more recent years, people have illegally introduced new invasive species to Van Isle that are now a tremendous competition for salmonids. In some cases, they're the major predators of small trout. Bullfrogs have swarmed over the South Island, and they're heading north. One individual, the same person, as I understand it, who introduced smallmouth bass into Shawnigan Lake, also introduced populations of largemouth bass and yellow perch into a number of island lakes. And now there are bullhead catfish in a number of island lakes on the South Island, along with enormous carp the size of Chinook salmon in Elk Lake. The lakes I used to know and love are become a dog's breakfast of invasive species, and lake ecology is in a state of rapid flux and chaos. The recent policy change to encourage anglers to exterminate bass is one response to this. Politicians and bureaucrats are under pressure to do something, anything, to save the salmon and save the trout fisheries. I see this recent move as a disaster for Van Isle lakes, and let me explain my reasoning, like solving an equation in Math 101, where you have to prove your steps. The recreational fishers don't kill all the bass. They can't kill all the bass. They can easily catch and kill most of the big fish sitting on the spawning beds, but there are always a few they miss. More important, there are thousands of juvenile bass that remain in the lake after the recreational fishermen lose interest in killing the big ones on the spawning beds. The result is not the elimination of bass, or maybe not even in the reduction of the total bass population. There may actually be more bass in the lake after the big ones are removed, because there's nothing left to eat the little ones. The thousands of hatchery trout dumped into the lakes every year don't eat baby bass. And they're engineered to eat tiny little bugs between the hours of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And they don't eat pumpkin seed sunfish, and they don't eat yellow perch or juvenile largemouth bass either. So this recent policy change serves to kill off the recreational bass fishery, not the bass population. More important, it removes the only significant predator that used to control the millions of small invasive fish in these lakes for a century. The Van Isle bass were ruled over by a small population of giant smallmouth bass. Now these big bass are mostly gone, and the populations of sunfish and perch and juvenile bass are exploding. So to me, this recent policy shift was the camel that broke the straw's back. The only way to maintain any recreational fishery in these lakes now is to dump in truckloads of hatchery Frankenfish. So once again, I repeat that I'm in favor of maintaining smallmouth bass in some or all of the lakes they inhabit here on Van Isle if they're managed as a quality recreational fishery. And I'm also in favor of eradicating all of them if they're not managed as a recreational game fish. Either option, to me, is better than the current policy. Smallmouth are a wonderful species to have around if there are a few of them that become a trophy class catch and release recreational fishery. They help to contain these swarming populations of more dangerous invasive fish. But they're a horrible menace to have around if they become part of the swarms of small invasive fish that now dominate most of the traditional smallmouth lakes here. Declaring war on the big smallmouth bass is actually a giant enhancement project for pumpkin seeds and perch and largemouth bass, and it may actually serve to increase the total number of smallmouth in the lake. It's just that instead of one big one in the future, there'll be 10 little ones. One thing this policy shift does is to establish a precedent. Bass are no longer a game fish here. They're an invasive species, so I'm hoping that the next step will be to eliminate the bass, along with the sunfish and the perch and the catfish and the largemouth bass and the carp. Eliminate them for good. I don't know if anyone has dared to mention the R word yet, but if not, I'll speak it here. Rotenone. Now that bass are going to be managed as invasive species, let's work together to kill all of them. And let's poison every single fish in these bass lakes that are infested with invasive species. Rotenone acts fast. It's relatively harmless to critters other than fish, and the province has lots of experience using it. You'd be right back in business 24 hours later without all of these other infested species. So I'm not an expert in doing this, but I expect you could use it to eradicate every fish in every bass lake here, with the exception of Shawnigan, which is probably too deep for rotenone to be effective, and besides, it has a really effective coho, artificially created coho run established by volunteers, and you don't want to be poisoning them up. So I don't know what to say about Shawnigan, but let's get started on the smaller lakes and work up to the bigger ones, I would suggest. So if there's a rotenone bandwagon, Humpty Dumpling is officially climbing onto it. And if there's not, he's starting one right here and now, and you can jump on board with him if you want. In other parts of BC, bass are spreading into places where it will be never possible to remove them with rotenone or any other technology other than thermonuclear bombs. There are largemouth bass in the lower Fraser River, and smallmouth and largemouth through the Okanagan, and largemouth in the upper Columbia, and more watersheds all the time where the Bass Bucket Brigade idiots have been active. So, I have no comment or advice to people in those watersheds. That's their problem. I'm thinking about Vancouver Island right now. We still have the opportunity here on Van Isle to eradicate every single one of these invasive fish in every lake except Shawnigan in short order. If bass are no longer a game fish and not going to be managed as a game fish, let's proceed with the process of getting them the hell off of Vancouver Island. So it was important for me to go through this long, boring rant. I think it's important for Humpty to explain his flip-flop between promoting these lakes as some of the finest urban recreational fisheries he's ever seen, which they were not that long ago, to promoting the idea of killing every single fish in them. It wasn't Humpty that did the flip-flop. It was the province. But now that we've crossed that bridge and burned it behind us, in my opinion, let's not stop halfway, and let's proceed on with due vigor, because the status quo is a disaster, in my opinion. From the point of view of an industrial Frankenfishery that approaches fisheries management as a simple question of how many truckloads of hatchery fish they can dump into a lake each year, these questions hardly matter. Their job is just to supply the market with product. But from my point of view, these lakes were the finest examples of sustainable urban trophy-class trout and smallmouth bass fisheries I've ever seen. Now they're slush pits swarming with millions of invasive fish from foreign watersheds, including government-subsidized Frankenfish. I never even go near them anymore. It's just too sad for me. I've been hanging around these lakes for half a century, and it's heartbreaking for me to watch what's going on. It may be a crude metaphor, but imagine the most beautiful, sweet young woman you ever met in your whole life, pure and innocent, and the next time you go to see her, she's snorting crack and eating junk food and putting on a few pounds, and the next time you see her, she's really fat and she has open sores and she's sticking needles of heroin into her arm, and the next time you see her, she's skinny and incoherent and her teeth are falling out, and I'd rather remember her as she was, and that's why I don't go fishing at these bass lakes around Van Isle anymore. So this is not the end of the Bass Stravaganza. I hope to continue filming, but not fishing trips. I'm hoping to improve my underwater fishing skills, and I just bought a drone. I bought 2 drones, actually, under the logical assumption that anyone named Humpty Dumpling the first drone is going to crash and burn. That's my lifestyle, right? So maybe the second drone will get some good video footage, and so the future fishing episodes will be retrospectives, looking back in time to fisheries that are disappearing into the mist of history. And you can ignore Humpty's irrelevant chatter about sustainable wild recreational fisheries and consider the future bass episodes as another memorial and epitaph. These lakes deserve to be remembered, not just as another bunch of lakes full of Frankenfish, but for what they once were, the finest urban recreational fishery I've ever seen anywhere on this planet for cutthroat and planted rainbow and trophy-sized smallmouth bass. So it's not only bass fishing video that I have in storage, as you'll see in the next episode. I've got owl catch and release on homemade topwater lures, and bullfrogs on the dry fly, and brown trout in the Cowichan ripping at my funky homemade lures. One of the fun things about getting old is that you have so many memories to look back on. And in the case of Humpty Dumpling, it's not just memories. I've got years worth of home movies. I amaze myself when I turn my computer on. How can a lousy fisherman with cheap, crappy gear like Humpty Dumpling ever get hooked into wild fish like this? So let's get back on the water and start catching some fish in the next episode. This will be a better movie than I'll ever likely shoot again. And it's better for the YouTube viewers too. Humpty was so much younger then, and I must say he was a total hunk. You know, absolutely chiseled with abs like steel. I can see how those sexy bass groupie babes might have gotten excited in years gone by. So in the next episode, we're going to go out and do what the Bass Travel was originally intended to do. Just get out on the water and pay attention and search for fish. And next time we're going to do one of my favorite things, just fire up the old Volvo and head out to some place I've never been before. Throw the pontoon boat out on the lake and explore some water I'd never seen and strange watersheds that I'd heard about but never visited. There's not even much fishing in the next episode, but you do get out to visit the disappearing river and the Devil's Bathtub, and you know how many other fishing TV shows or video shows will take you out there. They're too busy reeling in fish. So before proceeding with phase 2 of the Bass Stravaganza, I want to add just a few more comments. You can see by watching my movies that I'm not trying to be popular. Like I was telling someone the other day, my target audience is people who are almost dead or people who are not yet born. And I don't really pay much attention to people outside that group. No offense, you're welcome to watch my videos, but you're not the people I'm making them for. It's fine with me if you want to watch something else. But I would like to give a shout out to all the people everywhere in extended care or assisted living facilities. You know, this COVID plague is a struggle for all of us, but for elderly people in isolated somewhere in care facilities, it's way harder. There's so many millions of people isolated in there with nothing to do except stare at their TVs and watch the latest updates on the international COVID news. So if you know somebody in that situation that you might think might be interested in watching my fishing stuff, please, not this boring episode, but you know, send them a link to some of my fishing videos and maybe give them a chance to watch something different and hop in the pontoon boat with Humpty in a virtual way.
Oh, man.
And explore some places that neither one of us has ever been to before.
Gee, it's like being hooked onto a hippopotamus.
So stay tuned for the next episode of the Bass Stravaganza.